Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, good morning. If you are joining us from the Far East, as our featured distinguished guest, Professor Ian McGonigle is,
Wow.
I believe Singapore does qualify for being in the Far East.
Oh, wow.
If very few of our usual community members and participants are joining us from Israel because it is very early in Israel right now, 3 o'clock in the morning. A number of Israeli friends and colleagues and students emailed me asking if we could record the event because while they cannot be with us in person, alive, they would like to listen to the conversation. They would like to know what transpires during this session. And if you're joining us from Montreal, as many on the screen do, then a beautiful good evening to everyone. Thank you very much for coming back once again to what is our last film session during the fall 2021 semester. My name is Professor Nikolenyi. I teach political science at Concordia University, and I've also been serving as the director of the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies. This is a very important year for the Institute as we are marking our 10th anniversary. So it's been already 10 years that we are up and running, and we are trying to share our passion with you, with our faculty, with our students, and with members of our community. And that is a passion to learn and teach about Israel. And I'm so delighted that we have this wonderful opportunity to bring to you today a dear colleague and a young filmmaker, Professor Ian McGonigle, who teaches anthropology, sociology, and I'm going to tell you more about his background in a moment, in Singapore, who made this very important film that all of you were able and had the opportunity to watch yesterday, Redemption. So Professor McGonigle hails from the Republic of Ireland, and he studied and did his PhD in biochemistry at King's College in Cambridge. And as he puts it in his biography, he became distracted by anthropology, which led him to do a master's degree in anthropology at the University of Chicago. And then a second PhD in anthropology as well, and Middle Eastern studies at Harvard University. Ian then completed his dissertation under the title Genomic Citizenship, which actually came out also as a book. As a dissertation, it was awarded the Association for Middle East Anthropology Dissertation Award, and as I mentioned, it was recently published by MIT Press. In 2018, so already 3 years ago, Ian took up the Nanyang Assistant Professorship in Singapore, where he received a grant to launch a science and society research group. And he's currently doing ethnographic work with religious Jewish winemakers in the contested territories of Israel and the Palestinian territories. And it is this film that we've so much enjoyed and were able to watch comes out of that project, as I understand it. Ian, welcome to the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies, and thank you so much for being with us, joining us all the way from Singapore. And thank you for making the movie.
Thank you, Csaba. It's great to be with you guys, especially with the Israel Studies audience. And thank you for the invitation, and thank you to the Azrieli Institute for making this happen.
So Ian, our usual format is that I would fire away a couple of opening questions, and then, as we already heard from Rosa in the audience, I would open it up for a direct Q&A. As I mentioned, I would also like to bring in some comments that members of the community, our community, who cannot join us at this hour, sent me so that you would be able to react to them. And so at the very beginning, Ian, I would like to get your reaction to your own statement about the film. And just for the benefit of the audience, let me just quote directly from your own statement on how this movie came about, how this film came about. And this is what you say, and I quote, "He lifted up the bottle and studiously examined the label, a gentle squint revealing his disapproval. The wine was from the contested territories. By spending a year in Israel, doing anthropological research for my PhD on human genetics and its role in national identity formation, I, that is Ian, realized during a dinner party that in Israel, wine is both a political and a religious issue. A few years later, after I started a job as an assistant professor of sociology in Singapore, where my research was supported with a generous startup grant, I began learning about photography and film, leading me to return to Israel to interview the region's winemakers on camera. This film is the product of those trips, and I hope, you hope, that by understanding the beliefs and motivations of the winemakers, we may all better understand the complexity of this fraught region and also learn something about the ancient and the important role of wine in religious Jewish life. So Ian, this is what you said at the time when the movie was finished and it was made. So how do you reflect? How do you look back on these words now? Have you learned more about what the way you call it, this fraught region and the importance of wine? And if so, what is that new knowledge that you, the filmmaker, have benefited from, have acquired?
Thanks, Csaba. That's a great question. As you read it out, I guess I'm struck by the fact that I'm reminded that I wrote this as a director's statement, which might not necessarily be the same way I would write a scholarly statement. So I guess it's written in a sort of a genre that would open up the film to as wide an audience as possible, free of jargon, free of any understanding and background in Israel studies. But maybe I'll talk about some of the scholarly significance, since this is an Israel studies group. I wanted to know essentially what are the religious motivations of the settlers. Now there is existing scholarship on in anthropology on the settlers that's identified the theological motivations. That is to say, the belief that religious Jews are returning to a biblical territory, that this return is part of a divine plan, which they read as the realization of biblical prophecies. And this is broadly known, but I wanted to really understand whether that was a superficial belief, whether that was a very sincere belief, whether that was a strong motivation that could explain the apparent contradiction that religious Jews want to live in a part of Israel, Palestine, the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, whatever term you call it, that's very fraught. It's very tumultuous. There are quite often terror attacks. And I wanted to explore how it is that despite these challenges, despite these dangers, all the reasons why not to want to live in the West Bank, that religious Jews flock there. And not only flock there, but seem to thrive there and build their families, their communities, and lead fulfilling lives. I wanted to explore that I think, so there's a contradiction that needs to be explained. And it needs to be explained because the settlements remain very enigmatic. I think when we read about the settlements in news media, it's very often sensationalized. It's very often very one-dimensional. You get a stereotype of the settler more often than not. And I wanted to explore the complexity of these communities and get to the bottom of why these people want to live there. And I found that winemaking was one way to get to that. In anthropology, you have to pick a size, or pick a field site, pick a scope that's manageable as an ethnographer, as a researcher. So I couldn't survey the whole of the West Bank area. So I picked winemaking as a window into those logics. And there are plenty of reasons why winemaking is particularly suitable for exploring those motivations. But that was in terms of Israel studies, it was trying to understand the broader cultural logics and motivations of settlement through the stories of the winemakers. So that's really the ambition of the project.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Ian. And by the way, please don't think for a moment that you have to be only scholarly in this discussion, because we do welcome a broad segment of both the academic and non-academic community to these conversations. So if you want to be jargon rich, it's your call. If you want to be jargon free, that is also perfectly fine. I do have to confess that reading out your director's statement really resonated with me. I have been many times in wine shops in Jerusalem in particular, where I usually am when I go to Israel, when I would see people walking into the wine shop and either only looking for wines from the territories or dafka wine that is from anywhere but the territory. So wine is really an interesting cleavage, but that's just my reflection and my engagement with this particular process. I want to make sure that we get to this very important question that Rosa raised about generations. Having interviewed a range of representative voices from the winemaker community, can you tell us a little bit about how you feel, how you look at the next generation? Are they looking at the importance of wine planting, wine growing in much the same way as the somewhat older generation? And I'm not saying that you only interviewed the older generation, we did see a variety. But in any event, what's your sense of this generational divide, if there is one?
First of all, I'd say that's a really important question, because the settlements, really started in the late 60s, early 70s, and now there's about 400,000 settlers living in what's considered across the Green Line. So, the next generations are very important to attend to and to see what they're up to. In terms of the winemakers I interviewed for the film about 18. And I think from the winemakers that you saw in the film, maybe 3 are in their 30s, and most are probably 40s, 50s, perhaps 60s. So and this demographic broadly reflects the maturing nature of the settlements, I would say. And winemaking also reflects that sort of, what I say, the coming of age of communities that have, gotten their basic infrastructure in order, and they can turn their focus to perhaps more sophisticated agricultural pursuits. And winemaking takes a lot of investments. It takes several years to get a vineyard off the ground. It takes several years for these wineries to start producing good wine. So there is a delayed maturation. Most of these wineries really began in the early 2000s, and it's only in the last, I would say, 5 or 10 years that they've become very noteworthy internationally for producing high quality wine. In terms of younger Israelis going into winemaking, I haven't got a wide enough data set, in short, to talk with authority about the demographics. But I will say that one of the winemakers that I interviewed, Nir Chen, he was at Azrieli University and at the Center for Wine Research. So there is wine research at the universities, and they are teaching this. Yeah. So one could be hopeful that younger Israelis are learning winemaking and pursuing it. But I don't have data as to speak to how many graduates per year. But that's an interesting question. Yeah.
Ian, let me bring in 2 other voices that I received reactions to the film. One of them challenges you and asked me to raise it to you, share this comment with you, goes as follows. I agree with most of what was presented in the film. However, it seems to me that the film is more of a promotional for the regional councils of Judea and Samaria, the towns, the settlements, and the wineries, more than anything else with its clear political agenda. Minutes apart, I got another comment asking from another member of the viewer community, asking me to tell you a fabulous film, in every way. Your film touches a number of different chords. What are the voices that you feel you might have wanted to engage, but you decided not to? If you were to make the film again, would you bring in voices that we currently don't get? And I'm asking this sort of following up on the first comment that I shared with you, where the viewer felt that maybe there was too much emphasis on what represents the winemaker's ideology and conviction, which is what you wanted to explore. But we know
that's a great question. I guess I would just initially say that it's very difficult to represent a contentious territory without at the same time somehow advocating. By representing the views of the people you're working with, you inadvertently repeat and reproduce that culture. So that's sort of a professional hazard in anthropology, let's say. I was very concerned that first and foremost that what the film would represent would be acceptable to my informants, that it wasn't seen by the winemakers as manipulated or a kind of a motivated journalism that was editing and curating their comments with an agenda. So I was very cautious that was something I didn't want to do. And before I finished the film, I did I workshopped the film with colleagues and got feedback from friends and colleagues from various disciplines around the world to get their sense of, is it too pro-settler? Is it too anti-settler? I didn't want to be seen to be sort of representing their religious views as, unreasonable or something like that. So the question of political balance is definitely a challenge. I was surprised because I felt that I got comments from colleagues. Some thought exactly that it seemed like it was promoting winemaking in the West Bank. Some thought that it was very balanced, and some thought that it was maybe a little bit too much political criticism from some of the academic narrators that were brought in. So I was actually pleased to hear this, because if you've displeased everybody, you're probably somewhere close to a balanced and fair representation. So I did get a range of feedback from different folks in terms of how I was representing different views and angles. I was actually in Jerusalem March 2020, and I was in the process of doing the final interviews. And perhaps I would have liked to interview a few more winemakers, perhaps some of the more boutique, smaller home-based wineries. That would have been interesting. But in terms of, say, other viewpoints, early on in the project, I had considered looking at Palestinian wineries. So there are Christian Palestinian wineries in the region. I reached out to some, and after I had begun working with the Jewish winemakers in the region, I didn't get responses. So I'd shared like a trailer clip with a couple of the wineries. And my sense is that on the one hand, it's politically difficult to cross that divide. And particularly in a project like this, I'm not so sure that balance is what you're looking for, in the sense that you have to have a clear research question or a clear motivation that you want to explore. And by presenting it as a conflict with two sides, rather than as an investigation simply and solely into the religious motivations of the Jewish settlers, I think that it would have been a very different film. And there's something that, by making it a conflict story and a moral story about, which group has a more legitimate claim on the territory, it would have been a very different film. And it would have been more difficult to generate the kind of ethnographic sympathy to, have a sustained engagement with the motivations and the religious beliefs of the settler winemakers. So I'm not sure would I change the say the political valence of the film if I were to do it again.
Sure. Ian, are you planning or have you done any screening of the film in Israel already? Or do you have any?
I have not done it. I've not done a screening in Israel. The film was accepted at a couple of online festivals and it was available online. Catalina Film Festival in California, it was an official selection. And I made sure to reach out to all of the interviewees from the film and I made it available to them. So they had a link and they were able to watch the film, which is the first time they saw it.
You mentioned that you shared the film with some of your colleagues, I believe, in Singapore.
That's right.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the reaction? It's just fascinating for us to know that a group of academics and scholars in Singapore are watching a film about the settlement wine industry that you have made.
Yeah, absolutely.
How did it get across? What was if you could just color that reception of the film in that context by that audience, by that community for us a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So first of all, I would say, broadly speaking, it's important to understand that Singapore is good friends with Israel. They have had long-term military collaborations and, Singaporeans are very well disposed towards Israel. And the politics, particularly of the conflict, are completely different here. People seem, broadly supportive of Israel, I would say. So that's a little bit about the context. I received feedback from some colleagues who are in the Jewish community here, some colleagues, a couple of folks that were involved in the Israeli community in Singapore, and also colleagues in sociology and in the social sciences at NTU. But mostly at the point at which I did the screening, it was quite a rough cut, meaning I hadn't finished the music, which really changes the feel of the film, by the way. When the music's added on, it tells you how you're supposed to feel in each scene, and it completely changes the mood. So it was an early cut, and what I think most of my colleagues wanted more of was more of the sense of being there in the fields with them. This documentary is mostly based on interviews, and most of the anthropologists and sociologists wanted to see more of the winemaking, see more of the digging the soil, get more of a sense of the texture of the place and the sounds and the feel of being there. So in the final cut, I reintroduced a lot more of this B-roll activity of people in the wineries, in the fields, handling the grapes, that kind of thing. I would have liked, perhaps if I had the chance to go back, I would have liked to have been there for the harvest in September, October. That would have been nice, but that wasn't, we're in the middle of our semester and then COVID and everything. But yeah, I think as an ethnographic film, people want more of that. And then in terms of the sort of political content, I got a mix of opinions, I think it's quite an individual thing rather than like a professional ethic, I would say. That there are different, some people are more, enjoyed the film, and some people thought it was a little bit too pro-settler. So there's a mix of opinions in that regard.
But as you mentioned very eloquently, this is part of the deal when you do anthropology, right? You represent and you represent the subject, yes. And then you can be easily held responsible for perhaps advocating for them, which is not at all the intention. Ian, you interviewed 18 voices, 18 winemakers. How did you find them? Tell us a little bit about how you actually found these winemakers. Was there anyone you would have liked to bring on camera but couldn't, other than the ones that you have mentioned already in the Christian?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was still at Harvard finishing my PhD, which is on genetics and identity in the Middle East. And I was sort of towards the end of that and writing up the dissertation. And I had, during my time in Israel, as you noted, I'd begun to get interested in wine and winemaking and the political character of wine in Israel. and I received a summer research grant from the Center for Middle Eastern Studies and the Department of Anthropology at Harvard to investigate wine and identity. And the initial link was that at the time there were some interesting news articles about indigenous grapes, which is to say grapes that are identified as unique to Israel and that have been there for a long, long time. And some of the wine researchers at Azrieli University were doing the genetics of these varietals. So there's a connection with my work on human genetics and identity and winemaking, in that there was some research on the genetics of grapes to identify these indigenous varietals. And so that also resonates with ideas of indigenous belonging in the land. So that was the initial connection. Mm-hmm. So I went June 2017 to Jerusalem. I spent about a month. And then the first trip, I essentially was sitting in a hostel, and I knew the way it is in Israel, things are very casual, things are very spontaneous. It's very difficult to schedule several days in advance. So I found myself sitting in the hostel with a notepad and my phone, and I was going to the Facebook pages of the wineries. I was doing Google searches, was reading news articles about the wineries, and I was composing a list of the wineries in the West Bank, and I was calling them up. I knew that if I wrote an email saying, "Dear so-and-so, right, this is a researcher from the US," that I'm probably not going to get a response. So WhatsApping them in Hebrew was helpful, or calling them up on the phone and being very casual. "Hey, I'm here. I'm writing an article about your winery. I'd love to come and visit and have a chat with you and interview you for the piece. Are you available?" And that was an approach that was quite effective. So I visited maybe 10 wineries on that trip and had short meetings with the winemakers, maybe 40 minutes, an hour for an interview. And I was riding around on the Israeli bus from Jerusalem up and down Route 60. And at the end of that trip, I wrote a short journalistic piece on these wineries and this idea of wine, ethnic identity, and rooting in the land. And after that, it kind of sat with me, and I realized this is a really interesting topic. This says a lot about the settlement projects and their motivations, and the grape as a symbol of Jewish return, but also the vine as a symbol of rooting in the land. So I stuck with the project, and then after I came to Singapore, I made a short trip back to touch base with the winemakers, because about a year and a half had passed. Mm-hmm. And before I invested significant research funds, I wanted to make sure that, first of all, that these winemakers liked what I wrote the first time, that they didn't, hate it, and that they'd be willing to meet with me again and talk to me. So I made a trip back November 2018, and same again, I was still hopping around on the bus. And I went back to most of these wineries and had a follow-up interview. And I wanted to, basically the purpose was to ask them, would you be willing to be in a film if I made a film about this topic? And most of them were very happy and agreed. So after that, I was able to invest in my film training and learn how to use the camera and record the sound and everything. And then I went back in June 2019 and did most of the interviews over about 6 weeks, something like that. But in short, WhatsApp and calling them up and being quite casual about it has been a good way to recruit subjects.
This is wonderful, because it really shows that for you to be effective and successful at getting your subjects, you really have to know already the Israeli reality. Just as you said, you had to know what flies and what doesn't fly. You had to know that Israeli society is very casual, spontaneous, ad hoc, and that's how you had to master that to your advantage. Ian, tell us a little bit about the title of the film, Redemption.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Very meaningful. Did you play with other possibilities did you have other alternative titles you were thinking of? And what does the title mean, and what do you want to convey with this choice?
Absolutely. So there is a trend in anthropology to use what you might think of as native concepts when you're studying different cultures. So that is to say, rather than describing in a kind of a disenchanted rational language simply what you're describing and what you've observed, to find the concepts that are meaningful and potent and relevant that the subjects themselves are using, and to try and explain their world using their own concepts, so to speak. And after I did all these interviews and sat with the material and thought about it, I think that the concept of redemption is central, which is to say the winemakers see themselves as living out the redemption, or what in Hebrew is geulah. And this is not an arbitrary concept. It's part of what they see as the realization of thousands of year old biblical prophecies about the return of the Jewish people to their ancestral homeland. So I wanted to capture that there is a story here. There's a narrative frame that the winemakers, many of them are very explicit about it, that they see themselves living out. So that was what I wanted to capture with redemption. It's not redemption in the sort of Hollywood sense of a dramatic adventure or something like that. It's redemption in the sense of the realization of biblical prophecies. I'm not sure I thought much about other titles. The subtitle is Wine and Prophecy in the Land of Israel. That could have been the title also, but that became the subtitle because I think that ultimately what I think is perhaps the most interesting finding of the film is that this temporal frame of redemption that the religious settlers and the winemakers in particular see themselves as living out is very powerful at structuring their ambitions for the future. And I'll say a little bit more on that, which is to say that the temporal frame of redemption is 7,000 years. This is from the year 0 in the Hebrew calendar to the year 7,000. And in terms of the messianic prophecies, the Jewish Messiah is expected before the year 6,000, and then there's supposed to be 1,000 years of prosperity. So this is actually crucial, understanding this temporal worldview, to understand their ambitions and their willingness to endure, as in what I said is quite a challenging area. They believe that they are living out the days of redemption, and that this involves patience and this involves sacrifice. And the individual winemakers may not see this ultimate completion of this, longue durée process of redemption, but that they find great meaning and satisfaction and purpose in living it out. So I think that the concept of redemption is crucial.
Oh, it's beautifully captured, and I think you're absolutely right. This is the right title to sum it all up. Ian, I have 2 other quick questions that I would like to get your reactions to. And with that said, I would also like to ask our viewers to please leave any comments, any questions that you would like to ask or put to Ian at this point in the chat box. I see there are a couple of comments already, which I'm going to share with you, Ian, in a moment. But first, let me just get to my 2 quick pointers to you. The first one is about a memorable moment that lingers with you from this experience of having made the movie. Is there a character? Is there a fact? Is there a moment that somehow grabbed you and stayed with you, even after all these months that the film is now finished?
Yeah. When people ask me about the experience of making the film, I like to tell them about a story when I visited Sagot Winery, which is just outside Jerusalem. And the winemaker is Yaakov Uriah. He's one of Israel's top winemakers. And I did a great interview with him, but he ended up not being in the film because his focus is more on wine excellence, and he told me about some fascinating techniques that he's innovated in terms of different harvesting at different temperatures, harvesting at different points in the season to get different balances of flavor. So he's really an outstanding winemaker. And after our interview, he said, come with me. And I drove my car after his car, and he brought me back to the original site of the initial winery in Psagot. And there's a cave. And he brought me across the vineyard and into this cave. This is a cave from the Roman period. And this is a cave where they found the coin that's famously stuck on, the replica of which is stuck on the Psagot winery bottles. And we went into this Roman cave where they were storing a few barrels of brandy. So the winery had made a few barrels of brandy that were in this dark, damp, cool cave. And this was, it was June in Israel. It was already really hot and sun beating down outside, but we're in this cool cave, and he opens up the barrel of brandy and takes out some brandy, and we're sampling this, fantastic brandy in this ancient Roman cave where they found this coin from a couple of thousand years ago. So that, I always tell that story and tell people, listen, this is a blessing. It's a great privilege to be able to do this as a research project and be able to do this professionally and get to visit these places and experience these things. It's wonderful.
Ian, my own last question is about a quote that really stayed with me. It's towards the end of the film. It was said by the character whom you also have on the flyer, or whom we put on the flyer, the gentleman with the piece of wine or grape sticking out of his mouth. And he tells us his encounter with people who ask him, does all this land belong to you? And after some hesitation, he says, no, I belong to the land. That's my favorite quote from the film. What's yours?
Yes, that's, I think that's a great quote. Yeah. Yoram Cohen from Tanya Winery. Yeah, he was great. Very, very great subject to interview. Yeah, I had more material from him. My favorite quote. Yeah, that was a good one. I actually, more recently, I liked the story of Chonia Me'egel that Erez Ben Saadon told, because I think that as a sort of a parable, it makes the argument that I was alluding to earlier about the implications in terms of temporality, that the winemakers are living out the days of redemption, and that they see themselves as living out a process that transcends their own lifetime. And I've been writing about this. I'm writing an article about this topic, which comes out of the experience of making the film. But these kinds of quotes that make it so clear what their beliefs and motivations and views are, that they don't expect to reap the benefits in their own generation, but that this is a project that transcends their individual lifetimes. So that's, I think, for me, in terms of the take home, that would possibly be it.
And we actually saw that being acted out by one of your subjects, who stands by the tree, right, that he planted. And look,
that's right.
It is going to be here way after I'm gone. That's beautiful.
That's right.
Thank you so much. We have a couple of comments on the generational issue. So let me just maybe read a couple of them out, and I will try to connect them into a question. So, because they are phrased as comments. So here is one. I think that the current generation wants to make money. Winemaking is hard work. It's hard to be involved in this business. The way to become rich today is to do startup companies and be involved in technology. I think that this generation is not that religious anymore, and they don't think about redemption. And then we have another comment, again on the generational issue. The present generation, I don't think, sees itself as Zionist, and Zionistically connected to the land. And I don't think that they think about redemption as such. So what's your sense of the future? And what's your sense of how representative these 18 interviewees are of all of these processes and populations that the comments are commenting on?
I would say, first of all, it certainly depends where you are in Israel. I spent about a year in Tel Aviv. It's a very secular city. It's a very globalized city. It's a very progressive city. It's very different to spending time in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is much more traditional, much more religious. You meet very different people in Tel Aviv than you do in Jerusalem, for example. So there are plenty of young religious nationalists that are absolutely driven by meaning and driven by these kinds of ideas of redemption and living for a messianic future. So I think it depends. There's certainly, you're going to meet people that are disconnected from the religious element, but you'll also find, depending on where you are, particularly in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank and the settlements, you'll meet young people that are, studying Torah and are deeply connected to these concepts and issues. I would say that also these aren't I've said Tel Aviv is different from Jerusalem, but you find these two poles of society in individuals as well. For example, the young winemaker Avi Pollack, who was in the film, who described he lost his wife and he's raising his kids by himself. He's a very interesting character because he's trained in computer science and he worked in high tech and he still works in high tech, but he also founded the winery, Tom Winery in Givat Sheva 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 is the name of the location. So he is doing both. He's a young person who has established a winery, but he's also working in high tech as well. So yes and no, you can have both elements. They're not necessarily exclusive, that you can, be committed to these kinds of religious nationalist projects and also be part of, the high-tech world or the globalized commercial world as well. They're not necessarily exclusive. But in terms of how representative overall are these views, it's hard to say. I don't have the demographic data. All I would say is that it always struck me as somewhat surprising how conservative Israelis are, and they vote conservative compared to younger people, say in Europe or in North America. So I don't know how representative the views of the film are in terms of the overall population. But then again, it's hard to come up with overall views because Israel is quite fragmented. Secular Israel is not, Haredi Israel or Arab Israel or national religious Israel. These are, almost different worlds.
Great. Ian, let me share another set of questions that came in, and they are very nicely connected. So let me share them as they are written. First of all, great film, bravo, and thanks. And here are a few questions. Did any of the winemakers in the film consider other agricultural products that can complement grapes and wine? So what about the other 6 species like figs, barley, olives, etc., that the land of Israel is so well known for? Question number
Absolutely.
2. Are most or all of the employees local families or Arabs are also employed? What can you tell us about who the employees are who actually help the winemakers in the actual work? And the third question, can you please contrast the winemakers in Judea with those in the Golan Heights or in the Galil in terms of their identity or in terms of what they told you about the multiple dimensions of redemption and the different issues that you explored in the film?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's exactly right in terms of the other products that the winemakers are involved with producing. For example, in Tom Winery, in Givat Sheva Sheva Sheva, they grow blueberries also, and peonies, flowers they grow. and perhaps other products. It wasn't something I was went out with explicit intention to focus on, but I'm aware of other products. Olives for sure. I know Yekev Tora, they're producing olive oil, and I know that the Rimia winery in Susia, they're also producing honey. So there's definitely a range of other agricultural products, and many of them were selling chocolate as well.
Right.
So and this speaks to a sort of a growing gourmandization, I would say, of Israeli society, and that particularly in the settlements that are, wealthier, there's an appetite for the good life, and that they're producing high quality agricultural products to cater to that. In terms of the workers, this is not something that I have great detail on. For sure, there are a lot of Thai agricultural workers. Thailand, Thai workers are, they can get visas to come and work in Israel, and they're affordable compared to Israelis. I believe that in the past there were more productive relations with the Arab-Palestinian populations, and several of the winemakers told me that over the years this has become more and more difficult. It's become difficult because I believe there are laws that make it illegal to transfer money to a Palestinian bank account from Israelis, if I'm not mistaken. So there are lots of bureaucratic difficulties. It's not simply an ethnic conflict or an enmity or a lack of willingness on the part of the populations, but I think there are also technical and bureaucratic difficulties that make that more difficult. And then also I would say there are also quite a lot of Christian volunteers. So that my virtual background is Har Gerizim, the Mount of Blessing near Shechem, Nablus in the northern West Bank. And on this mountain and in these vineyards, there are a lot of Christian volunteers that, particularly from North America, that go on a volunteer during the harvest. And they're also invested in this idea of redemption and in what they believe is the return of the Messiah. And they believe that they're helping bring that about by helping restore Jews to the land. This is not an area of my focus, but something that I'm aware of, that there are also Christian volunteers. So there are different populations involved in this project, definitely. And then in terms of the difference between Judea and Samaria and the Golan Heights, I interviewed one winemaker for the film from the Golan Heights because I thought he had a particularly compelling story. Yeah. But he was, I think, the only winemaker who was not Orthodox that I interviewed. So there's a different I think there's a different political culture perhaps in the Golan Heights. There are fewer religiously motivated settlers in the Golan Heights compared to Judea and Samaria. Judea and Samaria, is understood as the heartland of Israel, containing many key biblical sites and sites of spiritual importance. The Golan Heights also has a rich history of Jewish settlement in the distant past, but I'm not so sure that the messianic religious fervor underpins the motivation for winemaking in the same way as it does in Judea and Samaria.
And I thought that your conversation with your interviewees brought out these multiple layers of historical connections with the different parts of the land. The Derek HaAvot, for example, in the center, the biblical references to the area around Hebron, Shechem, is one story. Then, of course, we have the later stories around Gamla, which also is recounted and remembered by one of I believe by that one interviewer from the Golan Heights. So that was very, very nicely done and meaningfully done. Ian, we don't have any other questions coming in. So what I would like to do at this point is to offer you our huge heartfelt gratitude and thanks for accepting our invitation and for agreeing to show the film and joining us in this conversation at this early hour for you in Singapore, and at this late hour for us in Montreal. And I'm in between, so it's getting almost dawn in the part of the world where I am. It's been absolutely wonderful. Your work is so important, and on behalf of our students, faculty, and members of our community, I really want to wish you all the luck in your continued endeavors to study, explore, and tease out these fascinating aspects of Israeli identity. Thank you for your work, Ian, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Csaba. It was a pleasure to be with you and to have these great questions and to revisit the material, having had a little bit of distance, having finished the film several months ago. So yeah, it's a real pleasure and an honor. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Ian. So ladies and gentlemen, before I would let you go, just a quick reminder that not at the same time, a little bit earlier at 10:30 Montreal time, Eastern Standard Time, but in the same place that is on your computer screen, we will be meeting again for another virtual talk, which will be given by Dr. Sarah Salon from the Hadassah University Hospital in Jerusalem, who will be telling us about her research into reviving the ancient Judean date palm. So we are still continuing very much on the topic of land, agriculture, and science, but a slightly different product, if you will, and a different historical reality. Looking forward to welcoming you back tomorrow morning at 10:30 Montreal time. And Ian, thank you once again for being with us. Bye-bye.